Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the day, the closing keynote with Jacinda Ardern, author and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Jacinda will be in conversation with Ruby Shamir, writer and adapter of the book they will be discussing today, the YA adaptation of What If You Could, a guide for young readers on chasing your dreams and embracing the unexpected qualities that truly make a person strong. It will be out June 2nd from Penguin Young Readers. Jacinda, Ruby, welcome, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Hello, and thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you also to the School Library Journal for hosting this event. My name is Ruby Shamir. I'm a writer, and I've written books in my own name and many more in collaboration with other authors. I am thrilled to be here today in conversation with one of my favorite authors to work with, Jacinda Ardern. At the age of 37, the Right Honorable Dame Jacinda Ardern served as the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand and became the second woman in history to give birth while leading a country. Miss Ardern champions an inclusive and empathetic leadership style that, during leadership, made bold policy change and successfully guided her nation through unprecedented global and domestic challenges, such as a live-streamed domestic terror attack targeting New Zealand's Muslim community, a volcanic eruption, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Responding with a people-first approach grounded in kindness, New Zealand achieved one of the lowest losses of life during the pandemic among developed nations. Miss Ardern continues to hold roles that allow her to be useful, serving as a distinguished fellow of the World Leaders Circle at Oxford University, patron of the Christchurch Call, and member of the Law Zero Board of Governors. She remains an active advocate for climate action, serving as COP30 Special Envoy for Oceania and trustee of the Earthshot Prize. She also leads FIELD, a fellowship program for empathetic leadership in politics, which she founded in 2024. And she's the author of the international bestseller, A Different Kind of Power. When our brilliant editor, Talia Benamy, and our wise publisher, Jill Santopolo, approached me about adapting A Different Kind of Power for young readers, I didn't hesitate. I had long admired Jacinda from afar, for precisely the reasons I just read to you all about in her bio. But when I actually read her adult book in preparation for the work of adapting it, I was gobsmacked. Jacinda revealed herself to be funny and insightful and empathetic and kind. But where I found I best related to her was in the stories of her youth and coming of age. Even though my upbringing was very different, I'm the child of artist immigrants and I grew up in the Bronx, but I saw myself in her story. I too had felt uncertainty, insecurity, and wanted to be useful. I too was a sensitive child who thought about the problems of the wider world that I saw in the news and was motivated to work in government and politics as a result, which I did for years before turning to writing. And like Jacinda, I even competed in high school speech and debate. It was clear to me that Jacinda's story would have the range and depth to really resonate with young people. So with that, let's get talking about What If You Could. Jacinda, What If You Could is a young reader's edition of your adult memoir, A Different Kind of Power, and it's specifically for tweens. Can you give us a brief overview of what this book covers and how it is different from the adult book?
Well, kia ora everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. And I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Ruby because, of course, no one knows this book better. And I was, so excited when the idea of turning my memoir into a book targeted towards young people was put to me because when I originally started writing, someone asked me, who are you writing for? And in my mind, I always had my 14-year-old self. And although, of course, memoir isn't usually targeted towards that age range, the themes that were in that adult memoir still are, in my mind, would resonate with a young person who harbors self-doubt. So one of the biggest differences, I think, is that we've been able to really draw out some of that. Yes, the adult memoir has a good chunk of childhood, but it doesn't really amplify or focus in as much as we have with this youth reader into grappling with imposter syndrome as a young person and how self-limiting that can be, and how the combination of not only a lack of confidence, but sometimes feeling small in the world, whether it's because you grew up in a small town or because you feel so feel like the events of the world are so overwhelming. Even when you feel that way, there are things that you can do that in the long run may bring you on a path or a trajectory for major change in the future.
Building a little bit on that, we're right now speaking to a room full of educators and librarians who work with young people, whether in libraries or schools or elsewhere. And I guess the question is, why was it important to create a Young Readers Edition? Why did you feel like you wanted to speak specifically to this audience? And what do you hope they take away from it?
As I've always been aware of the fact that I have a bit of the old imposter syndrome, but it's easy, I think, to believe that when you are in that position that you're, in a bit of a minority, that it's not something that's widely held, and it's part of the reason that actually it can affect the choices you make. I'm not good enough, therefore I shouldn't or I can't. But as a member of parliament, we used to have this challenge back in New Zealand, which was about chasing your dreams. And one of the things that you would do as a young leader and a leader in your community is we'd have the opportunity to go into schools and talk to young people. And I remember one day going in and talking to a group of young women. They would have been 14 or 15. And I went through an exercise where I asked them to write down their dream job, put it on a piece of paper, and all of them wrote instantly something down on that page. And then I asked them, well, now write down what you think you'll do. Now, I expected some of them to ask me if it was a trick question, but they didn't. Almost with only a few seconds of hesitation and thought, did they write a second thing down? And I then asked a few of them to share with me what they'd written. And one girl put her hand up and she said, if I could do anything, I want to be a doctor. And I said, well, what do you think you're going to do? And she said, I think I'm going to be a travel agent. And something broke in my heart. I asked, why do you think that you can't be a doctor? And she said, there'll just be other people who will be better than I am. Uh, that was the same story across at least half of that classroom. What was happening to our young people, where even at such a young age, they hold these dreams and aspirations, but they're already putting this self-limiting talk or these self-limiting beliefs into their own minds and probably into practice as well. So I really, from that moment on, I've been so committed to the idea of trying to challenge our young people not to let their own self-doubt or even the doubt of others cause them to limit themselves and potentially deprive them of fulfilling their own potential. And so much of this book is aimed at trying to not just bring that into question, but use myself as an example of had it not been for some very unusual circumstances, perhaps I too could have held myself back. So don't be that person. There's enough barriers in the world that we need to make sure that you are yourself, not one of them.
And one of the things that you do write about with respect to that is the idea that sometimes what we think of as our drawbacks are actually our strengths.
Absolutely. And that one I learned through leadership. That one took a little bit of time. I mean, I remember when I came into Parliament still believing, and this is, captured in the book, still believing that my sensitivity, my empathy, these were things that weren't going to make me tough enough for a political environment. And how many workplaces could we say that for as well? And that therefore, yes, I'd got there, but now I would need to go through the process of changing fundamentally who I was. And through my time in politics, and I had 15 years in Parliament, I really learned that actually, uh, imposter syndrome meant that I would go out and I would learn everything that I could. It meant that I would talk to experts and I would learn and I would bring some humility to a challenge. And those were all good traits in leadership, but also my empathy was what made me, I think, a better politician. And so, really going through that journey and shortcutting that a little bit and sharing that these things we're told are weaknesses and that we're told are weak are the exact opposite. They are in many cases your greatest strengths.
Building on that, and with respect to your leadership style, you write a lot about the importance of kindness in leadership, kindness in general, and kindness in leadership in particular. And we're now living in a time where many leaders around the world seem to be moving in the opposite direction. Social media seems to reward baseness and outrage. So, what do you
Mm.
think are some practical ways that kindness can make headway?
I think in some ways kindness is often dismissed because, particularly in a political environment, there's a view that you can't command the respect and confidence of others if you're an empathetic person or someone who's driven by kindness as a set of values. And I disagree with that. There are plenty of politicians who really value empathy, but I think perhaps what made our government different is we talked about it. We talked about it as it being a value that was at the center of some of our decision making. And in doing so, I think really challenged this idea that you couldn't both have strength and the confidence of the people you lead, as well as bringing kindness as a value. Uh, One of the reasons I also really wanted to challenge the absence of kindness is because it's is a value that generally is pretty universal. You think about the things that you teach your kids. By and large, most people will teach their kids curiosity, bravery, generosity. We're always teaching them to try and share, but we by and large will all teach kindness as well. That's not kind. Please all try and be kind. It's really, really one of those mantras that we're always repeating. And yet somehow, when it comes to leaders, we lose that expectation. I think the things that we value enough to teach our kids should be the things we value enough that we should expect it to be held onto by our leaders as well.
Absolutely. Do you have any memories of something in the book that maybe exemplifies the work of kindness, the importance of kindness, a story or a portion of the book?
Two examples, I think, in writing it, particularly in those younger years, there were some things that as I was writing, I was like, actually, that was pretty formative, and found how much of it, of course, actually just came from my parents. My mother was a very generous, giving person. My father was a policeman, and New Zealand, the policing in New Zealand is fundamentally different to other places that I've seen, governed by the idea of community policing, the idea that you actually and policing by consent, the idea that you'll always be outnumbered. To be successful, you have to have the support of the community that you serve, and it just changes that dynamic. And we lived in a very small town in New Zealand called Murupara, and my dad took on his first role leading a station there. There were only 3 police officers in that town. And as he worked to build trust, I observed the way that he operated, and I observed his use of power. He was always mindful of the dignity of others. He never saw the world in a black and white way. It was always grey. Someone didn't suddenly just land in the criminal justice system from nowhere. There was a journey that was had, and it was often a very, very difficult one, often potted with stories of poverty. And so watching his use of and his the way that he treated power, I think, was very, very formative. I think the second example I would draw out is, March 15 was when New Zealand experienced a horrific domestic terror attack. Someone motivated by hate took the lives of 51 members of New Zealand's Muslim community. And there's a lot of commentary often around New Zealand's response to that horrific event, which was to absolutely denounce the hatred that caused and motivated that attacker, and to denounce the attacker himself, but also to couple that with an outpouring of love and empathy and collective grief to the Muslim community. That in my mind was a demonstration of empathy in action, but not just that, but the demand of us as politicians that we do something to try and prevent it ever happening again. And as a result, we had a near unanimous support for the banning of semi-automatic and military-style weapons in New Zealand 10 days after that law was introduced. And that for me exemplifies again that empathetic leadership is nothing without action. It's not performative. It's not just about grief or sharing in someone else's, as much as you're able to experience. It is about what you do about it. That is true empathy.
Absolutely. And it's beyond impressive. Something so many other countries I'm sure would love to do. And you've written that it's one of those things that gets spontaneous applause every time you talk about it, wherever you are in the world, that putting empathy into action and getting it done, and using all of that energy to actually have an impact. So thank you for that.
And in my mind, it was a response to what people were asking for. It's something captured in the book. People crisis demands change, and it will keep asking. It will keep asking. I'm a strong believer in that. I don't think there's ever a point when people feel that indifference should ever win. Um, Crisis keeps asking for change. Mm.
It's absolutely profound and 100% true. We see it all the time. Switching gears a tiny bit, you were one of the youngest people in the world to become prime minister and one of the youngest women to boot. Did that fact weigh on you in the moment? Does it weigh on you now? And is there a particular legacy you hope to leave for girls and young women who read the story?
No, I felt so lucky that I was the third, not the first, not the second, but the third female prime minister in New Zealand. And so it meant that that wasn't notable, and what a gift, because it meant that I never grew up believing that you couldn't be a woman in politics and that you couldn't be a woman and be prime minister. Instead, I just thought you couldn't be sensitive and, a bit of a crier and a warrior and be prime minister. That's what I fixated on instead. And actually, this is a real credit to the New Zealand public as well. I don't really particularly remember, I don't remember, therefore, obviously, as I say, gender being particularly pronounced. There were some subtle things, but it wasn't pronounced. My age, I don't remember being particularly noteworthy. There would be more broadly, you'd see overseas some headlines over it, and you'd see some focus on it. But at home, I didn't feel that.
Mm.
Uh, did I feel like I had something to prove every single day? But more often than not, it was to myself.
That's interesting. And do you, when you, now that you travel the world or you put this book together, I mean, do you find that any one population flocks to you more than others, or flocks to the story, girls, boys, or is it sort of more universal?
I think there's a universal element to many of the themes. Certainly. I do find, of course, that there are those countries that might follow New Zealand a little more closely and will be aware of some snippets of the story. And so, obviously, New Zealand's close relationship with Australia, the United Kingdom. But perhaps what I felt resonated, particularly in the United States, was being a woman in politics, but perhaps more so that there are alternative styles of leadership that are not just available, but have been road tested, have been supported by voters, and, dare I even say it, have been successful. And so this idea that there's only one form or one style has been challenged, albeit in smaller parts of the world, but New Zealand is not the only place. And so that's one of the things that I've noticed has resonated. You can be a kind leader, but you can be a strong leader too.
Absolutely. Um, Again, sort of building on that, the world's challenges right now seem very big and very overwhelming. And I know that you're currently doing, and you did before, but you're currently working on climate change, on AI. And these are some of the overwhelming, somewhat stressful issues that are dominating conversation and that people feel maybe worried about. How do you recommend that young people who care about these issues and others get started? And what can the adults in their lives do to support them?
Yeah, I think this is one of the huge challenges. I remember as a young person being really overwhelmed by, we had such horrific famine. There was warfare. There was even one of our environmental challenges at the time. New Zealand had no ozone layer when I was a young person. I remember learning about the impact of chlorofluorocarbons on New Zealand, and it's so easy to feel completely overwhelmed. What are you, as one, not just an individual, but a young person, possibly going to do? And that can make you feel helpless. And it can also, as we're seeing in this generation, fuel such anxiety, particularly over climate change. The one message that I frequently share, and I hope is captured in this book, that actually your individual contribution does matter. What you can do in your community or in your school life or, even in your peer group does make a difference because cumulatively that has impact. And if I use the example of climate change, it's a little bit like, the challenge we have in front of us is a little bit like a game of football. Yes, governments set the rules of the game. They can speed the game up, they can slow the game down, but they are not the only players on the field. There are absolutely others that can fundamentally make a difference in this challenge. So almost in this time, it's both because of and in spite of politics that I want young people to be engaged. Don't give up on it, try and change it, but keep doing what you can do as well in your own corner of the world. My first political act was to try and get our school uniform changed. You have no idea where those things can take you. Mhm.
Absolutely. And you write in the book about young people when you were prime minister, young people who gathered petitions and lobbied and actually were moved change and I think helped set the course of some policy.
A couple of examples. One was, yes, some young women in particular were rightfully aggrieved that there wasn't enough knowledge around the New Zealand wars and that early conflict between Indigenous Maori and the British who colonized New Zealand. And so, as a consequence of them really bringing to the fore the need for recognition of those historic events, we moved as quickly as we could to put New Zealand history as a compulsory part of our curriculum. Um, on another experience I recall, I when I came into office, I decided that I wanted to read every letter that came in from a young person and make sure that they got an individual reply. And I thought at the time, how many young people are going to write to the Prime Minister? As it turns out, quite a few. We had to hire extra people to help process all these letters. And I remember noticing that I was getting an extraordinary number of letters about single-use plastic bags, and we'd already intended to ban them, but the timeline was quite long and difficult to phase them out. And I remember after reading like my gazillionth letter, calling the minister in charge of that policy and saying, "Can we bring it forward? This matters so much to young people." And so we did. We brought it forward. We hastened its introduction, and then I started getting letters about straws.
No good deed. um, I'm going to move into what I think is probably our final question. And that is in the book, you write about the tension between yearning to be useful, whether on your parents' orchard or later in politics, and a sense of imposter syndrome. I'd love for you to tease that out a little bit and tell us about how you wrote about managing that tension and how you might recommend young people do so.
Yeah, I think in the early stages of writing the first adult version of the book, I wanted to convey that idea that we often grapple with two competing tensions. And in my case, that battle was this: I want so much to be useful in the world. I don't need to be in charge. I don't need a spotlight. I don't crave infamy, fame. I just want to do good. I want to be useful. I want to feel like that I've made a difference somehow. But on the other hand, I doubt myself. I doubt my ability to be a person of influence or to drive change, and that constant tension between those two things. And as it happened, my trajectory meant that I was faced with the responsibility when my leader of our party, when I was in politics, believed that he wasn't going to win the election, and 7 weeks out, told me that he thought I needed to take over. And of course, at that point, I said no, I couldn't possibly do it. And then he came to work and he quit and nominated me. So I didn't have to choose between those dueling voices because it was chosen for me, in the sense that I was told, look, it's time to feel the burn of responsibility and ignore that self-doubt and just see what you are capable of. And so I don't want to leave it to chance to other people, for other people or young people to be put in their position. I want them to choose to challenge themselves because we do not know what we are capable of until we are doing it. So this book is really dedicated to the idea of encouraging young people to take that chance on themselves. And I hope as a result of reading What If You Could that they do.
Absolutely. And, that's the question. What if you could? There
What
shouldn't be anything that would hold you back.
exactly.
Uh,
Exactly.
well, thank you so much, Jacinda, for writing this book, for inviting me along on the journey. It has truly been a pleasure and an honor for me. And thank you again to our publisher, Jill Santopolo, our editor, Talia Benamy, for making this book a reality. And thanks to this School Library Journal for hosting us today. I don't know if you want to say anything else, but I was going to
Oh,
I'll turn it over back to
just
the SLJ.
just a huge thank you and for the influence that you all have in people's lives. I have such fond memories of the equivalent version in New Zealand. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and keep going.
Thank you both so much. And before you go, I just want to kind of drive home the point. The tween years can be so confusing, and the word you used a couple times, overwhelming. And I just love that you're providing them with a story that can teach them about empowerment and kindness and empathy. It's just so important, I think, now more than ever. So thank you. It's been a pleasure having you both. And I'll bid you two a good day. And then to all the librarians and educators out there, thank you so much for joining us for the Penguin Random House Spring Book and Author Festival. Remember that all of today's panels are archived, available on demand for 3 months, along with all of the content in the booth. So if you didn't get a chance to roam around there and find some good freebies and downloads, you have 3 months to do so. A special thanks to all of our many partners and sponsors for helping to make this event possible. And of course, another thanks to the authors and creators who shared their craft with us. So now I bid you a farewell. Go forth and read.